ACRL's Health. Ooh, yes, and there's a recording. It's hosted by ACRL's Health Sciences Interest Group and the Evidence Synthesis Methods Interest Group. So my name is Anna Ferry. I'm the Evidence Synthesis Librarian at Colorado State University and the incoming convener for the Evidence Synthesis Group, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's panel. I'm joined by Erica Dufresne, who is the Associate Social Sciences Librarian at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and who is our current convener for the Evidence Synthesis Methods Interest Group. And monitoring our chat today is Jessica Hollister, from the dental librarian at the University of Buffalo, who is co-chair of the Health Sciences Interest Group and co-chair, excuse me, of the Health Sciences Interest Group Programming Committee with Jules Bailey, who is at the University of South Florida. Is that correct? South Florida. And who could not join us today, but I wanted to acknowledge her because she put a bunch of labor into putting this together. So the topic of our forum today is evidence synthesis, searching and support with interdisciplinary overlap. So we are joined by a panel of librarians with experience in interdisciplinary evidence synthesis projects that overlap health and medicine with a variety of other fields. The format of the forum today will be a moderated panel discussion to get us started for the first hour. So we have a whole bunch of questions for our wonderful panelists. And then in the second section, 30 minutes of it, we will have an open Q&A. We do ask that attendees remain muted during the first panel portion as we're kind of doing that section. And then in the later section, you can unmute if you have a question. It's helpful if you go to the React button at the bottom. One of the options in there is a raise your hand, and then we can call on you to ask whatever questions you might have during that second section. We are following the ALA online code of conduct today, so we do want to acknowledge that. And then we also want to acknowledge that we are recording the panel discussion today. So we will be recording the panel portion, that first hour where we have prepared questions for our panelists. The second section, that 30 minutes where we have time for open Q&A, we will not be recording that part. And then after the forum, our recording of that first section will go up on the ACRL Health Sciences Research Guide, maybe on the Evidence Synthesis Methods Group research guide as well. I don't know. I haven't talked that with Erica, actually. But at the very least, it will go out to the listservs for both the Health Sciences and Evidence Synthesis Methods interest groups and to everybody who registered today. All right, all that intro part. Let's get started with the actual folks here today. So I want to briefly introduce our panelists for today. They'll be doing a more full introduction in a moment, but just a quick introduction of who we've got here today. We have Matt Kibbe from from Cornell University, who's the evidence synthesis coordinator there. We have Kazette Comer, who's the assistant director of evidence synthesis services at Virginia Tech. We have Megan Coker, who is the Sciences and Evidence Synthesis Librarian at the University of Minnesota. And we have Heather McDonald, who is a Health Sciences, STEM, and Research Services Librarian at Carleton University. And we have Vitalina, who is Vitalina Robinson. I am looking at the wrong thing, so I'm getting confused at where I'm reading. Robinson, who is the librarian for psychology and sociology at the University of Michigan. And a note for our panelists, we will be addressing these questions for the whole group of you, but we have not said you have to answer every single one of them. So if you don't feel like you have an answer, or if you feel like what you wanted to say has already been fully expounded on by somebody else, that's fine. Feel free to chime in at your discretion. There is no particular order to these. Jump on in there. But I'm going to go ahead and get us started by actually walking through a random order of each of you to go ahead and do question number 1, which is, please tell us your name, job title, where you work, and most importantly, a bit of background about how you became involved in evidence synthesis in your career. And again, no particular order here. So Megan, would you go ahead and get us started?
Sure. So, as Anna said, I'm Megan Coker. I am at the University of Minnesota Libraries. And my official liaison departments that I support are food science and nutrition, soil, water, and climate, and applied economics. And I also did animal science for a long time. So, when I started doing evidence synthesis, I was also doing that. And the background for how I became involved in evidence synthesis really is through nutrition, not surprisingly, was my first department where I started getting requests to work on systematic reviews and things. And that was in around 2016, 2017. And we had, our institution had a systematic review service for our health sciences library, but nutrition is part of the agriculture library where I am. Um, and so, the health sciences librarians would come to me and say, we got a systematic review request from nutrition. Do you want to work on it? And I said, yes. And then I was like, tell me what that is. How do I do it? And then that opened up a whole world for me. Then went on to co-lead our evidence synthesis service for the non-health sciences, along with my colleague Amy Riggleman in the social sciences. We co-lead that together, and also worked with partners at Cornell, who was our best friend in starting our evidence synthesis service. We were coming up around the same time and doing similar things. So we've worked a lot with Cornell and Carnegie Mellon. The three of us worked together on starting the Evidence Synthesis Institute, which I see a lot of names of people I know who have attended. So that is, in a nutshell, my background.
Thank you. And Heather, would you go ahead and jump in next?
Sure. So my path was a bit different. I worked in biology labs for a number of years, then went back to school to do an MLIS and covered a maternity leave, and then was hired to work virtually for St. Michael's Hospital Knowledge Translation Program. And I worked there in not just actually not as an information specialist, but through the whole process of reviews. So doing the screening, doing the data extraction. So I got a very fulsome experience with them. And so I started at Carleton in 2014 and was working part-time with St. Mike's for the first, I don't know, 8 years while I was there. And in 2020, when COVID hit, we started a knowledge synthesis service because there was just so much demand for it. And the first review I did was with social work. I've continued to work with that group and beyond. And we're now a team of 3. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Vitalina, would you jump in next?
Yeah, so my name is Vitalina Robinson. I use she, her pronouns. So I started at Temple working as part of the health sciences team, even though I was an education librarian. Um, and there was just one team at the time that was led by Stephanie Roth, who was there at the time. And so there was an apprenticeship model that she developed with our former colleague, Natalie Taggy. And I knew that this was kind of something that was happening more in social sciences. So I thought, okay, well, I can just get the level of knowledge for like answering questions during a reference interview. And then I started doing the apprenticeship and was like, it's interesting, actually. This like scratches an itch in my brain, this searching thing. So I did do the Evidence Synthesis Institute. So I learned from many of the panelists here. And shout out to my now colleagues at University of Michigan Taubman, because they are a vast wealth of knowledge. And I also took their class for the informationists. So that is how I got involved.
Fantastic. That sounds surprisingly similar to how I ended up in my situation. Matt, would you go ahead and jump in next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Kivy. Yeah, my title, Evidence Synthesis Coordinator, and I'm the lead of the Evidence Synthesis Service at Cornell University. My origin story was kind of exciting, at least in a nerdy perspective. When during the pandemic, I was a reference assistant at the library, Mann Library here at Cornell, and the university was creating a model to sort of decide whether it could reopen safely in the middle of the pandemic, and it commissioned a series of rapid reviews from the then head of the evidence synthesis service here, Kate Gezi-Kopel, to sort of answer a bunch of questions that would the data of which would inform this model. And because of the quick turnaround time and the number of rapid reviews that were being done, Kate recruited from all over the library and asked me to help with the review. And it was a very quick process, whisked me into Covidence, and just started screening. And even though it was, just yes, no, maybes, clicking a bunch, there was something about being part of this really big project that you're kind of all pulling in the same direction, and a project that would have like a massive impact on deciding whether my colleagues would return to the university. And so something about that, I was just immediately hooked. And so when an evidence synthesis librarian position opened up at Cornell, I jumped on it, and yeah, the rest is history.
Thanks. All right, Cosette, last but not least.
Well, thank you. And I guess I can also, serve as a little bit of a contrast too, because I do not have a background in library sciences. But my first foray into evidence synthesis was actually in my previous career as a research assistant for a transportation research institute. And I was on a team of folks that were studying impaired driving research. And so it was a really interesting kind of cross between human factors transportation. And I got to bring my social science background. I have a master's in sociology, and I got to bring that to the table. And I worked with a bunch of engineers and psychology folks. And I ended up getting handed this state of knowledge update as my kind of thing to lead. And they called it a systematic review and meta-analysis. 7 years later, I now realize probably more of a scoping review. But I kind of fell in love with the process. I got to, be kind of the low rung on the team, but I got to do all of this kind of work to figure out, okay, what is it that we're actually trying to do here, and make these recommendations for, okay, we might not be doing a medical or a clinical systematic review, but we are claiming to try to do a full systematic review. And so I'd refer to the Cochrane Handbook and say, well, here are the methods that we're supposed to employ. How do we adopt that for this particular setting? And so this was well before my time in libraries, but an evidence synthesis librarian position opened up with Virginia Tech, and I was really excited by the idea of being able to do this full time. And so I went for it, and I now am a few titles later, the Assistant Director for Evidence Synthesis Services. We have the privilege of building up a full team that has been born into the interdisciplinary space. We actually do not have a health-focused team for evidence synthesis, and so we get the privilege of serving the entire university and collaborating closely with our health sciences folks. And I'm excited to talk about what that looks like across the board.
For sure. All right, so for the rest of the questions here, they are open. Please answer as you feel they are relevant to you. Some of what we're going to talk about, you may have expanded on already. And just to be clear, Jessica is popping the questions as we go along in the chat. So if you've lost track of what the question is, you can go find the question in the chat. The next question is, what are your areas of expertise with evidence synthesis searching outside of the health sciences? And can you give us an example of a review you've worked on that sort of bridges that gap between health and medicine and non-health and medicine subjects?
Well, since I just got done talking, I can kind of bridge this into the next topic area, right? So my background is solidly in social sciences, and that's where I feel most comfortable. But of course, a lot of the work that we get has something to do with health sciences. So I've written a few down just because I don't want to mess up my words. Some of the examples that I would point to that kind of bridge this gap between health and medicine and the more non-health subjects, particularly I'm thinking about that public health space, might be our systematic review and meta-analysis that is looking at pregnant populations and their exposure to flooding events during pregnancy and the impact that that had on preterm birth and birth rates and gestational weight. That was a really interesting one because having to figure out how not only to talk about those environmental factors, which can be a little bit more varied. And like one of the questions we had was, do we care about flooding if it occurred because of a hurricane? We did. But if it occurred because of an earthquake, we didn't. So it's an interesting set of nuances we got to grapple with. And then the other cool thing about that is that it just, you know, the way that you study that topic is not going to ever be a randomized control trial, right? We're only dealing with observational studies, a lot of post hoc studies. And so grappling with that in the title, or actually in the data extraction phase was a huge issue. Another example of a systematic review is a unmet needs of daily activity in daily activities. So like showering, eating, walking around for community dwelling older adults and the impact on hospitalization rates. And so that whole section of our search that was talking about what are activities of daily living. Well, luckily there is an accepted standard for and description for that. But coming up with all of the different ways that across not just health sciences, but social science journals are going to be talking about it took some time. I won't belabor the point and pass it to some other folks.
I can go next. I've sort of been all over the place. So as you might imagine, with like nutrition and things come, like that public health connection is strong with the health sciences. So it's sort of an easy bridge there. And you can look at, I've done a lot on like the gut microbiome and athletes and their nutrition or things, or a lot of gut microbiome stuff, right? And also a lot of genetic counseling, which is a pretty easy connection because our genetic counseling program falls under the College of Biological Sciences, not the health sciences. Anyway, so a lot there. But I want to talk about some of the things in agriculture that like really are less like logical pairings. I think I did one recently on how trees outside forests contribute to human well-being. And this was with a team in forestry. So it's that looking at, you know, health effects of trees was pretty cool. And another one I did was on was when I was doing animal science. We did one on wild caught meat and food safety. And that was for a big report that went to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Administration. And so that's a lead in too. One of the biggest projects I worked on ever was the Series 2030 project out of Cornell. And that pulled together a whole bunch of research teams and a whole bunch of librarians for this sort of global effort to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals to end hunger. And what we did was looked at a whole bunch of what they were looking at. We were what interventions can in agriculture can have the biggest impact from donors in terms of reducing hunger. And like this was a huge question and a huge thing. My little portion of it was looking at oh my goodness, food not food waste, but like food that's lost along the supply chain or spoiled and things. And so that's a big question that crossed many disciplines. And it was huge having people from a bunch of different backgrounds in, you know, from agriculture, from health sciences, from business, from global development, that sort of stuff was a really interesting project. Like there are so many like big issues we can address with these. So that's me.
I can just speak briefly to I work with he's an epidemiologist and I've done a number of papers with him. So environmental health, and I'll just speak to the idea of chemical names. And finding an extensive, comprehensive list of chemical names has always been I actually quite enjoy it because of my educational background. But trying to make sure that, we have a comprehensive list, and it's usually tied to human health somehow. So then you're looking at a population as well and making sure that's a comprehensive search. But it's I've really enjoyed sort of digging into that. The one coming to mind was dioxin and dioxin-like pollutants. There's a lot of dioxin type chemicals, so that was very extensive. He's actually done one on greenness, which is interesting, Megan, because it was that, trees, but it was sort of bigger picture greenness. So yeah, it's been interesting working with him, and he's trained as an epidemiologist, so there's always a meta-analysis in there as well. So yeah.
I can ride the greenness train, and the sort of first review that I worked on was I just have to title up the effect of the natural environment and greenness on behavior, function, and well-being among individuals with autism. And that was it was super interesting for me in first starting out, where part of it is sort of more clinical focus, but when it comes time to write a search for nature, just writ large, imagining every single possible way in which nature can be described, and then also thinking about all the ways in which natural words are used metaphorically in other contexts. So inviting noise, that sort of kind of really made it clear to me how much sort of language is key in this, and especially once you get into social sciences or outside of the health sciences, the language gets a little looser, and it actually becomes a little more challenging to search for. And that actually, my background is in my educational background's in literature, and that was like, oh, I can use some of this. Finally, I can use some of it in the real world. And yeah, that was a kind of time for me where I sort of understood the complexities and scope that this work can have.
Don't feel pressured if you don't want to. I'm happy to jump to number 3.
I can give a few quick ones. They're similar to a couple of the other ones that we were talking about. Greenness, the effect of green spaces in urban built environments, and it was connected to social determinants of health, and there was a whole bunch of ACEs in there. So that took a lot of testing and such. A scoping review on ethnomethodology and conversation analysis for like race talk, but in medical settings. So that was interesting. It was a medical educator who was like, I know I'm a social scientist and I want to see it through this lens. And so that was very interesting. And then there was one that was a carbon isotope ratio as an objective biomarker of added sugar intake, which was nutrition and social and behavioral sciences. So yeah.
Some really fascinating ones in there. Also, some of the things where, like, when I hear the titles, I'm a little like, oh gosh, I can't imagine designing that search. Okay, yep, settle in. Okay, we're going to move on to our next question 3, which is which subject-specific databases outside of health sciences and medicine do you search in the most often? And what are some of the unique challenges or benefits of searching in those databases versus the more health sciences and medicine focused databases?
I can go because I've been having conversations with people. So I often do like multidisciplinary databases like Web of Science and Scopus, but I've really started to play with Lens and OpenAlex recently, and it's been really interesting. I'm actually using them almost like an alternative to Google Scholar, because everybody comes and says, oh, I also want to do a Google Scholar search, and it's just a pain to get anything out of Google Scholar. So I was literally on a call a couple weeks ago where a colleague said, oh, OpenAlex now allows you to do, I forget what the capacity was, but I think a bulk download or something. And it was just like, really? That's a game changer. So these two databases are really coming up in terms of viability I use them as a supplementary search because they're just very broad based. But I'm really intrigued with them. I'm finding them much better alternative to Google Scholar. I don't know if anybody here uses them for targeted searching, but they're just, I find it very exciting because they're very new. In terms of other subject specific ones, I often end up in the engineering literature just because of some of the searches I'm doing. So I'm very familiar with Engineering Village, IEEE, InSpec and Compendex on those, also GeoBase for some of the greenness stuff. Also agriculture, I've used CABI, you name it, basically any of the social science databases. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
I'll say I spend a lot of my time in CAB abstracts, Agricola, and the ProQuest Agricultural and Environmental Science database. So my big ag databases. And then there are some other, depending on the subject matter, there's, I think, a forestry database and some other ones. But those are my big ones that I spend a lot of time in agriculture. But then that combination, I'm also using, especially in nutrition, using all the medical databases a lot. And I can say that, what I often tell people is that sort of mesh is the like peak of what you're going to get and what you're going to get in Medline. And it all gets worse from there in the other databases. So some things, like CAB Abstracts, I think is a really great database and like has a like good structured vocabulary and stuff, but the application of stuff and so it's spotty across all these other databases. So it ends up being a lot more about keyword searching than necessarily using all the controlled vocabulary, I think, in a lot of the other databases. And like the ProQuest Agricultural and Environmental Sciences database, I don't usually even bother trying to use their controlled vocabulary. And so your mileage may vary and it's not going to have all the features. But some of them are really good, but nothing is going to get you like those medical databases like are a whole other level.
Megan, what interface do you search CAB abstracts with?
I have it on Ovid, which is really
Oh,
nice.
jealous.
I'm like the
Yeah.
only person that has, so I have both CAB abstracts and Agricola on Ovid, so that makes it pretty easy to search for me. But most other people have it on Web of Science or on
That's what I have. Yeah.
I think EBSCO. Yeah.
Yeah, Agricola and EBSCO. Yeah.
Other
I'm
things.
envious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then of course, I'm always using Web of Science and Scopus too, which are fine. But
Scopus less and less so these
Scopus
days. Yeah.
less and less so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes Cielo is one that I've been using more, like when I have teams that especially want to search in multiple languages, we'll pull that in. And we have that on Web of Science because searching through their interface is a mess. So having it on Web of Science is nice.
Yeah, mine are mostly the same as Megan's. Megan and I are going to have to struggle not to say me too after every response.
Also ditto. It is a lot of the same databases, but I do just want to throw out there, I mean, one of the things that I lean on very heavily because being spread out into all of these different disciplines and kind of having to pivot frequently, the importance of the help documentation and sometimes the lack of help documentation, and the importance of knowing your vendor contacts or at least your collections department. I have a very close relationship with my collections department. These things are changing so rapidly too. I think that's one of the most frustrating things, and I'll put in a pitch for I'd love for us to be at that table more often for before things get changed.
I use PsycInfo a lot, which I know a lot of people consider like right in there with the health and medicine. Social Index a lot on via EBSCO, communication and mass media complete via EBSCO, and I feel like an experience I had with that is very like absolutely everything that was said, like the peak meshes the peak you're going to get. I was working on a search for, again, the ethnomethodology and communication analysis. So I was like, oh, this will be great because this is like psychological discourse in that discipline, and microsociology in that discipline, and they're so rich and interdisciplinary. But the primary search, they wanted it in communication mass media complete. And so I have great colleagues, former social sciences colleague, Darlene Nichols and Kate Saylor looked at my search, and we were testing it, and it was such a mess because I'm used to, right, there's going to be an APA thesaurus at least, like I think of a thesaurus as something a little bit authoritative, like there's enough of a body of work that they've assigned this thing. And what we found was that I ended up having to search like without any tags or just like all fields, because DE, which is like exact subject, I expected that to be narrow, but SU being any kind of subject was not pointing at the thesaurus. Something called ZW was pointing at an index, which I would never look at the indexes, the indices or whatever. And then the keywords, I can't remember what was going on with the keywords, but yeah, ZW and SU did not cover most things. And so it was just like, let's do a free for all search. And I felt so uncomfortable because I was like, this is supposed to be the preliminary search, and this was to translate off of this. But yeah, it was just amazing that the source did not reference subject terms. And I then later learned that that database was made by smushing together two other databases. Yeah, and this all before the EBSCO interface transition. So yeah.
And Heather, do you have anything you want to add, or are we good to move on?
I started, so no.
Oh, sorry, I've lost track of the circle. How's that? So we'll go ahead for number 4. Have you worked on an interdisciplinary evidence synthesis project with journal hand searching, extra gray literature searching, or web searching? And how did you navigate this and discover these sources?
I can go.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, Matthew, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just briefly. I think I've worked on interdisciplinary evidence syntheses, and we've done at least some of these in each of them. I think one of the things that I realized quickly is different from the more health science reviews that I worked on. The kind of sources for gray literature were a little more standardized as far as for what you would search in systematic reviews, whereas in outside of the health sciences or more interdisciplinary projects, it was a little bit more work to try to talk to the researchers to understand where the relevant research might live, and they're just not really thinking about the different places where the literature is and what kind of methods we might have to go to search. And so there was a lot more back and forth, a lot more discussion. We would kind of look at other reviews and bring it to the research team and said, they searched here. Is that a good place to search for this information? So that's one big difference I've noticed. That health sciences seems a little more, they have sort of a standard sets of, these are for clinical trials, and this is where you search for dissertations and things like that. Whereas in more interdisciplinary ones, it's you feel like you're doing more pioneering work, I guess, or brush clearing to find what you need.
So when it comes to gray literature searching, I will help develop the search terms, but I push it back to the research term because so often they are doing screening as well as searching simultaneously because there's no download option. It's a website or an association or something. So I feel very strongly that I shouldn't be involved because I'm not doing the screening, although I have been involved in screening in other interviews, but I'll help them with, what it's like to develop the inclusion criteria, the search terms. But And so I'll say, no, here's a template that you can use to document everything, and this is how you go about documenting, but I do not do that searching. I train them how to search, show them how to screen, but then it's on the research team to do it.
I'll jump in to build off of Heather because that's been my approach as well. And I'll admit it's not only just because it's appropriate, because they're going to have to be making decisions that I should not be making, but also because my capacity historically, I've been a solo evidence synthesis librarian, and so it's not feasible to be doing that for every project that we're helping with. I will say, you know, one of the other things that I've helped with that Heather, you might also be helping your teams with is identifying scope boundaries. So one of the, right, like, because you can't find all gray literature. We know that, but that's not an option. So, for example, one student that I had been working with was doing an assessment of the regulations for fishermen, and how likely they were to adhere to those based off of certain feelings of social cohesion and community, et cetera. It was another one of those social science crossover sort of spaces, but in environmental sort of factors. And we made some boundaries about, you know, US and Canada only. We are going to look at the federal level. We are then going to select specific state level, like coastal state level, and then cut it there, because otherwise, like policy documents, otherwise it would just be forever. We would be looking for that literature. So.
I will just follow up and just say that I often say, you're going to make these boundaries, you have to explain why, right? And if it's a time limitation, resource limitation, that's fine. But so often, like, for example, like in a psychology context, well, the DSM introduced this definition at this date, therefore you're just going back. So, but explaining why you do things is just good research practice. And that's a big push that I use. Sorry to.
All right, I'm gonna jump in. So I was digging for this thing. So as I mentioned to some others, it is Evidence Synthesis Institute Canada this week. So I've been working with Canadian librarians all week, and one of them shared, so just got this resource yesterday, this Gray Literature Search Plan template that I put in the chat, which is so nice and gets at what I think I try to do with teams if they need to be working with gray literature. And that comes up a lot. You know, in agriculture, we're needing to look at the USDA and EPA, and there's a lot of local, you know, like your state government and agencies that need to come in. And so I usually try to sit down with the team and go, you know, this is your expertise, like in your area. So I want you to think through who all's reports and things you're going to need, what is going to be relevant to this, and let's like make a list and figure out how to search each of these sources and then have them go do it. And I've done it different ways. So this has, you know, a nice spreadsheet on it or sort of thing where you can track where you searched and for what and how many items you screened on it. I've done it where I've tried to like set up the searches for them and give them a link to like the Google search, and so they have the number of results, or I've just had them go do it on their own. So either way, but it's that complicated part then of like once they screen it, then how do we get it into our list with everything else and all of that stuff. But I do think I'm really excited to use this worksheet as a way to think through it in a more structured way.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the worksheet. That's super helpful. We can go ahead and jump into question number 5 then, if we're ready. In your experience, are there any significant differences that you found in working with faculty and students in the health and medicine versus those in other disciplines when you're doing evidence synthesis projects? I know this come up a little bit already, but let's see what else we've got to explore in here.
I hate to say something that sounds anti social sciences, but I think there's a lot of like allure to evidence synthesis. And there's a lot of graduate students that I find that come to me who have been told, like, you're going to do this kind of review, and they might not necessarily know what that means. And then when I look into it, their mentors maybe published some things that were called systematic reviews or meta-analyses. And if you put them into Trip Pro, it wouldn't be at the top of the pyramid, which is one of the things that I use to explain to them, like, what is actually the appropriate methodology for your question. But it's like any kind of reference interview we do, where it's like, what's your question, and how appropriate is this methodology? There's nothing wrong with a robust literature review, and then I also talk to them about bridging research and practice, and how that's kind of what we're hoping to achieve here. But yeah, so somebody says they've seen a lot with psychology and public health. Public health was considered both health sciences and social sciences at my last institution, so got a lot of experience with that. But yeah, there's a lot. It's challenging I get nervous navigating those conversations, because with education, there was a lot of things that were published in reputable education journals that had things in the title, and I had to explain why these weren't actually what they stated they were, and how, we want you to graduate and not say I've done this, and then someone would say this actually doesn't hold up to rigor. And sometimes that some faculty would take that kind of like not positively, but then if you help them with their next thing, it's another way in to teach them like the ideal best practice world we'd like to live in.
I was going to say, and I've had some science colleagues say like, no, this is for us too, but I'm not sure. I think in the ag departments and a lot of the other sciences that I work with, by and large, every team that I work with, this is not every now, but we get people coming back, but it is almost always their first time doing a project, an evidence synthesis project, and they really haven't seen other examples, heard of a protocol, any of this stuff. So like, solid 90% of the people I work with, like, this is a brand new thing, and we're going to be doing a lot of hand-holding and just like learning about this in the process. And I know, yeah, that happens a lot in the health sciences too, but I always like to think of like, oh, it's much more common there. People have at least heard of it or things. So I do think there is a difference there. And I also like, again, this is more from talking with my health sciences colleagues and stuff, that I feel like my teams are generally really happy to work with me and very respectful of my time. And I think, at the LESSS conference 2 years ago, like people were talking about like, do we call this a service? And then do people see us like, what does that do in terms of like power dynamics and what people are expectations? And I think in the sciences, I will say, and I can't speak to how or if this is very different from other stuff, but people are very used to having a lot of co-authors, are very excited. Like I've never gotten pushback even when I've had asked to have 2 or 3 librarians on there as co-authors for various reasons. Very excited to collaborate, like very respectful of my expertise and things, and working with me on it. So I think that is a really nice thing. And there's a lot of explaining and showing and like trying to relate it to, like would do a protocol for an experiment. You would do this for other things. So this is what this is like, and all of that. So that's what I've got.
Well, I actually have very strong feelings about this topic. So, my take on the disciplinary divide is that yes, there are disciplinary differences, and I think that those are important to grapple with. They're ontological and epistemological differences in how research is done in different fields. And to just totally ignore that is not helpful. Having said that, I think that sometimes we exacerbate the differences between disciplines when really the difference could be attributed to something else, some other characteristic, such as is the researcher used to the idea of open science? That can be confounded by, is open science something that's attractive to people in your field? But there are plenty of folks right now in social sciences who are really hyped about open science or addressing the reproducibility, the replicability crisis. And so I always try to tie that sort of conversation into it too. Obviously, all of our experiences are going to have some semblance of bias, right? Because the people who choose to come work with us are probably going to be a little bit more interested in those sorts of endeavors because we're all trying to improve the evidence base, hopefully. But to Vitalina's point earlier, I mean, yeah, a lot of students, especially in social sciences, are being assigned as part of their dissertation or their thesis or just classwork. You're going to do a systematic review. And I used to joke that in my first few years in this role, my office also served as kind of like a therapy space. The amount of tears when they realize, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to publish this thing. And I think that and you know, asterisks there, you might be able to publish it, right? But I do think that one of the characteristics of folks who are really resistant across health sciences and non-health sciences is if they had success publishing it previously. And I've really shifted my mindset away from just telling people they have to do these things because that's the right thing to do toward I'd love for to bring editors and peer reviewers and the folks who are publishing this material to the table with us so that they also know how to grapple with when we get a systematic review, what guidelines might I look at for my field? I don't think I mentioned it in my intro, but I am also a part-time PhD student in public administration and public affairs. They also suffer from this issue. And the first few years I was in that program, I got a lot of resistance from faculty. Now at this point, they are pulling me into classes. I am helping out with some editors of journals in those spaces. So I think don't give up on these social science spaces and try to find other ways to talk to them about these differences because I think that they will be on board if they see the value too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone has said, and yeah, the major difference between these two halves is the sort of familiarity in my experience with the methodologies and options. So, you know, the people here who do Cochrane reviews, everything is a very well-oiled machine, and I step on stage, I do my part, and I step off, and it's just everything's very well orchestrated. Whereas in the more social sciences things outside of the health science fields, you're much more of a mountain climbing guide. Like you're helping them get to the top, survive, and basically, you know, you've done this trek before, and you're helping them sort of navigate it. Yeah, I think Megan brought up authorship and sort of the standards around authorship, and I think that's a big difference. There are some people who are really excited about having multiple collaborators, and others get very squirrely when you start saying, "Well, if I do this, then I would, you know, it's required to be a co-author." Um, but I also think it's following Cosette a little bit and kind of like thinking about this question. I am wondering how much, you know, use or maybe we need to kind of maybe the divide between medical and non-medical or non-health science reviews. Maybe that's too crude of a distinction because and the longer I do this, the more I feel like I see sort of subcultures within individual disciplines that are actually so different that I feel a little odd making generalizations across such a broad spectrum of cultures, norms, expectations, and things like that.
So to follow up with an example of that exact thing, I was meeting with a faculty member with my business colleague, and I said, well, maybe this is actually a scoping review, which is often the case when they say they're going to be doing a systematic review. And the response from the faculty member was, in business, we call this a systematic review, which as soon as you hear that, it's like, okay. And it was a shift to, we do this because it makes it more transparent. If you're going to limit to a selected journal list, then these are the potential biases. So it was a very much a shift in how we spoke to people about how they conduct reviews, and recognizing that they have disciplinary norms and they have a literature base that they're drawing from. Whether they're following it exactly or not is questionable, but it was a wake-up call for me to not just assume health is all of this is the norm. It's not. It is very much disciplinary specific. And so that's why I tend to emphasize transparency over, this is a scoping review. This is an evidence gap map, because it's more important, particularly for graduate students, that they learn good research practice over and above whatever you want to call it, right? So it was a bit of a wake-up call for me. It was good. It was good.
That was such a great example of differences in field-specific literature bases and their traditions and production. I think that's such a good one for us to all keep in mind as we work in a variety of spaces. So next question is, there are specific methodological and reporting guidelines and evidence synthesis for various non-health sciences fields, from Campbell, CEE, etc. Have you had to navigate these different disciplinary guidelines with research teams, and can you describe that experience?
So I'll just say that both Cosette and I did the update for the Campbell search guidance. So we were a group of 10, and I was coordinating a group of phenomenal expert searchers. I'll say that right off the bat. But I often hand it out and say, hey, this is a good guide for you guys to use. We tried to make sure there was templates available. But I'm going to speak to CEE, which is a Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. I'm currently working with a group that's using that. I find the ecologists are they are very, very well aware of this. They have an abundance of literature. It's never an issue. I mention it, they're like, yes, we know. And so again, these are discipline specific. And so sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. But as soon as you say, oh, this is relevant to your discipline, they're very keen to take it on and learn it and walk through it with them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in right after Heather to add on. I think that this is related to the last conversation we were just having. I think that as soon as you show them, oh, actually, there are guidelines that, engineering is the big sticking point, because there aren't, if somebody has engineering guidelines, please share them, because we need that desperately. But if you have a social science adjacent topic, you're going to probably get something close in Campbell. If you've got an environmental topic, even kind of agriculture can fit into that space, right? It helps to break down that barrier of not in my discipline. I guess I could answer the question and say, I've used these tools quite a bit. I think they are fantastic. I lean very heavily on the most recent update of every guideline. And I think the cool thing about them is that there are throughways, right? There are consistencies that you can see across all of these. And Heather keeps mentioning transparency, and I just want to elevate that again too, right? We're trying to reduce the risk of bias. We're trying to be comprehensive. We're trying to be transparent. We're trying to do good science. So that's the hill to die on, right?
Can I jump in real quick I don't know how many of this applies to. I know it applies to Gazette because broadly they're broadly in here. When you're trying to stay updated on all the different ones, how do you deal with, there's so many of them? There's the different prismas, roses, there's the CE, there's so many of them to even take in the first place, nonetheless, try to keep updated with the new things that come out. How do you handle that?
I have a lot of Google alerts. I have Stork is an AI app that I started using that I think is really nice. I'll try to look it up here and share it in the chat, where you can set up alerts for scholarly literature. So just even paying attention to that material, I think is really helpful. You know, getting that material in your inbox is really helpful. I mean, honestly, I think also put a little less pressure on yourself, because like I very much accept that things will change faster than I'm going to be able to keep up with them in every field. So if somebody comes to me with an updated, you know, I share information that's outdated and they're like, well, what about this thing? I mean, that's great. Humility is good. And just always making sure to try to refer back to those, you know, the Prisma website. That would be, you know, the home bases to see the most current version, especially if you're iffy about something. Those would be.
And just a little add-on to Cosette, I mean, this is the drum that we beat in ESI, but just being part of listservs, communities, it's been a huge help, because you don't have to keep track of everything, and people are often very great about sort of notifying, hey, this came out, or asking for opinions on new updates or changes. So yeah, any expert searchers, listserv, the Evidence Synthesis Methods Interest Group, the Evidence Synthesis Institute, any of those kinds of groups that you can be on, that's been a huge help in keeping abreast of latest developments.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add to this. I've used the CEE Proceed Roses things before. Not a whole lot, but some. I'll throw in my little peeve about Proceed, which is the protocol registry for CEE, is that there's no template. There's no, you can't see what the fields are to fill in until you're filling them in. Um, which was also a problem with Prospero until very recently. They finally have a template, I think. So, um, or I might be wrong on that. I think I just saw this week that they have a template. So, um, but that's it. And that, explaining to the one time we worked with it, I had to like figure out and explain to my team that, to register and proceed, like you have to register there if you're going to publish in their journal, but you can register there if you're publishing anywhere else. So it's yeah.
All right, we'll go ahead and do our last formal question here and then open things up for the Q&A. And this has components to it. I'm going to ask it as a big mass so that we can move forward, but be patient, it'll go into chat. So can you describe any differences you have experiences and how researchers adherence practices for related to ES, such as protocol registration, including gray literature, these kind of components that we sort of think of as core? In the publication or peer review practices, or in the publication or peer review practices for evidence synthesis in these fields and health sciences, like are there differences there? One thing that came up when we were discussing this question is that we noticed that registering protocols is not always as common in all of the practice bases for non-health sciences fields. Is this something you've encountered with your teams, and how are you navigating it?
So if I'm on a team, I'll insist that they have a protocol, even if they don't publish it, because it's a document we can all refer back to. And I'll tell them, it doesn't matter if it changes, we have to document the change. But if we're working in a group environment, we have to have a road plan, which is essentially, I often call it a road plan instead of a protocol. Oftentimes, though, I'll say, and there's an option to publish. I do a lot of scoping reviews, so OSF is a popular repository for that. And they're like, oh, we can do that. That's great, because it gets assigned a DOI. Like it's all of a sudden it opens up a conversation about, open science. And so it's different. And I will suggest this to graduate students if I'm not on a team, but I'll say it shows your supervisor what your plan is. It tells any collaborators what your plan is, right? And it's just, again, it's just good research practice.
Yeah, I guess just a quick add-on to Heather. I think I will use anecdotes or horror stories to encourage them to register protocols, like being on reviews where you're two-thirds of the way through, and then another review is published. They didn't put out a protocol, so there was no way we could have known, and that sort of sinking feeling that you have when your review suddenly becomes irrelevant. And so mentioning to people that it's good sort of community practice to let other folks know what you're working on, and so that there's not redundant work, not research waste. I don't know if I think, just as we've said in general, it requires a little more explanation. It's really good to know, why you include these things, not just that you should, and so because oftentimes people will just ask, and it's not a challenging question, but they're just trying to understand, why is this necessary? It seems like a lot of work. What is the payoff? And so kind of explaining the principles behind some of these practices is a little more necessary, I would say, outside of the health sciences, but it's pretty common within them too, for at least for me.
The thing I'll add on to that, same stuff, is too that I try to always have several examples to show them, hopefully of similar review types from or similar topics. And so I either pull from my own projects or go look for other librarians I know who've worked on stuff and try to find a nice protocol to show them. And once they take a look at it, they usually are like, oh yeah, we can do this. So like, I think that helps a lot. But yeah, it is brand new. I think for vast majority of the groups that I work with, doing a protocol is a new thing. But I think it's pretty easy to explain why it's important in terms of science and transparency and all of the things. And also, like, I really sell it on like, this is going to be so much easier for us. Like, we make our plan ahead of a time and then we just do it. Like, we can always look back at it. Like, this is going to be our guide.
Having a lot of having some examples for them to show like here's a different psychoneuroimmunology protocol, and this is what it looks like, and then you can link it to other things in OSF. um, OSF is usually what we use, is helpful, and I think also showing them like the quoting the manuals where they're explaining like why it's important. We're already doing so much education anyways, might as well. And I think this is yet another place where there's not a big divide in my mind between like the researchers in the different disciplines. It's like, is this your first time doing it? Did your mentor do it this way? And that's how you're learning to do it. Um, and it reminds me of when you get like an instruction request of like, can you teach these three major concepts in 20 minutes? And you explain, no, I can't do that. I can do this. And then you get invited back next time with more time. Like, it's just teaching people, here's the gold standard, or this is what we would hope to achieve. And then they can see the difference, and like they can decide that it's worth it for them.
Yes, and to everything that my colleagues just said. I just want to add that, like I've mentioned through some of the other conversations, and to Vitalina's point, like this isn't unique to health sciences necessarily. You can find kind of similarities that are just manifesting in a slightly different way. I mentioned earlier the reproducibility crisis, right? And that was really hot when I first came into this field. And so the registered reports were a really big thing at the time, where people, especially in the social sciences, but in biology and some bench sciences too, were submitting their effectively protocol, their methods for these journals, getting those peer reviewed so that the quality is based on what you're going to do, not what your results are. And then it's like in some journals, a guaranteed acceptance. And we've got Campbell and we've got the CEE that will do similar. So just kind of tying it into that idea of this is, again, I'm borrowing again from Heather, the idea of like, these are just scientific methods. And that's what we're doing as science.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give a last chance for if the panelists have anything they want to make sure and add before we move into the big Q&A. But any last thoughts that you have about this that you feel like you haven't had the chance to expound on thus far?
Maybe just a quick thing, and anyone who's maybe comfortable in the health sciences, and I know some people feel a little bit of anxiety in venturing out and trying out doing evidence syntheses in interdisciplinary areas or non-health science. And I think we've been good, balanced about it, but I don't want to like add to anyone's anxiety. It's really fun in a big way. Like you feel like a real central part of the process, like a true partner, and as in addition to sort of a guide and a teacher in it. And so I would just, you do get to experiment and kind of expand your skill set, your understanding of the research landscape. And so I think these kinds of projects can be really rewarding, in addition to, the challenges that they may pose.
All right. Well, thank you for saying that, because actually I agree with that very much as well. That's certainly been my experience. I started with health sciences and now I work with everybody. And it's been fascinating finding all the different types of research production that are occurring across campus and learning about so many different topics and really getting the chance to talk in detail with people about the things that are passionate to them, like that they are really engaged with and interested in. I learned so much, and it does become really fun. Even as I'm like, how in the world are we going to come up with a term set for that? I'm still really excited to hear what they're working on. So that covers our recorded portion. So we'll close down the recording now.